while every other truck in the valley crawled toward the grain elevator, heavy with a year of sweat. Reidar Vangen turned his loaded semi around and drove it home. They said the cold had finally gotten into his head. They said the bank would own his land by spring. But Reidar Vangen knew something the rest of them had forgotten, that an empty bin belongs to the buyer, and a full one belongs to you. If stories about quiet stubbornness and the long patience of people who built this country move you stay with me to the end, subscribe and settle in, this one is worth the night. The Red River Valley does not roll. It lies flat as a tabletop from horizon to horizon, a sheet of black earth so level that a man standing in a field in October can watch the weather come at him for an hour before it arrives. There are no hills to hide behind here, no trees to break the wind, just the long open ground and the enormous sky, and in late autumn the smell of harvest hanging over all of it, chaff and diesel, and the sweet bruised scent of corn being torn from its stalks by the thousands of acres. It was the third week of October, near the little town of Tollerud, North Dakota, and the harvest was at its frantic peak. County Road 15 was a single, unbroken line of trucks. Grain carts and dusty semis crept bumper to bumper toward the tall concrete silos of the Tollerud Co-op, a slow funeral procession of every farmer for 40 miles. Inside those trucks sat the entire year for 50 families. They were all rushing to dump their corn before the price slid another nickel or the snow came early and locked the fields under ice. Up on the only rise in the whole township, a low gravel approach, barely 10 feet above the road. Reidar Vangen sat in the cab of his idling tractor and watched them go by. I was 59 years old, a third-generation grower, a man who looked like he'd been cut from the same black soil he worked. His hands were thick and cracked at the knuckles. His face was a slow record of every sun and every winter the valley had ever thrown at him. He farmed 1,600 acres of good Red River dirt, which made him respectable but small a minnow swimming beside the corporate operations that were quietly eating the county a quarter section at a time. And right now, he was doing the one thing guaranteed to make a man the joke of every coffee table in Tollerud. He was hoarding his crop. The town of Tollerud had opinions about most things, and it expressed them the way small Lutheran communities on the northern plains have always expressed opinions, not loudly, not directly, but with a patience that outlasted the subject of the opinion itself. There were 341 people in Tollerud proper, and every one of them knew, within 48 hours, when a neighbor made a decision worth discussing, and the place where the discussing happened was Bergstrom's, a diner on the main block that had not changed its menu or its counterstools since Gerald Ford was president. On the morning of the first day, Reidar turned his trucks around. There were 7 men at Bergstrom's counter by 6:15, which was 2 more than usual, and the extra 2 were there because word travels fast in flat country with no trees to slow it. The waitress, a woman named Darla, who had been pouring coffee at Bergstrom's since her oldest was in diapers, and her oldest now had a grandson, made her way down the counter without being asked. She had a gift for knowing which conversations needed her back turned, and which ones needed a refill as an excuse to linger, and this one she poured slowly. "That Vangen's lost his mind," said the man 2 stools from the window. 3:15 and he's running grain into those new bins like he's got money to light on fire. "His wife's a sensible woman," said another. Solveig'll talk him out of it in a week. Solveig Vangen Darla knew would not talk anyone out of anything they'd already decided, because Solveig Vangen was the kind of woman who decided things herself, and let other people think she was agreeing with them. Darla had gone to school with her, but she kept this observation to herself and moved the coffee pot to the other end of the counter. The man by the window shook his head. He borrowed against the home quarter, he said, and the counter went quiet, the way it only goes quiet when someone says a number or a name that changes the weight of a conversation. That's what my brother-in-law at First National says. Put up the old home ground to finance those bins. Nobody said anything for a moment. A few of the men looked at their coffee, and a few looked at the window and the flat country beyond it. Most of them had a piece of ground somewhere that meant the same thing the home quarter meant to a Vangen, and they understood without anyone explaining it what it cost to sign something like that. That's either the bravest thing or the stupidest thing I've heard this year, said the man at the far end, and nobody disagreed with either option, and Darla refilled the cup nearest her and moved on. Down at the co-op, the weighmaster, Kurt Algren, punched tickets and shook his head and tried not to look any farmer too long in the eye. The price of corn had fallen to $3.15 a bushel. It was the oldest trap in farming, the harvest glut, millions of bushels hitting the market in the same 3 weeks, choking the system until it gagged. The buyers knew the farmers had operating loans coming due. They knew the men in those trucks needed cash in their hands by Christmas, so the buyers set the price. And the price was an insult dressed up as a number. Reidar's two-way radio crackled against the dash. Boss the semis topped off. You want me to swing into town and get in the line? It'll be a couple hours, the way it looks. He keyed the mic and held it a moment before he answered the way he did everything. Negative, Casper. Bring her back to the home place. Run it into bin 2. A long pause, just static and the rumble of an engine somewhere out on the flat. The new bin's boss. They're near full already. And you seen the board this morning. Price keeps dropping. Kurt's paying $3.15 down there. I saw the board. Turn the truck around, son. He let go of the mic and set it back in its cradle and reached for the thermos of black coffee on the floorboard. He poured a careful capful and drank it slow, watching the line of trucks, and from the breast pocket of his coveralls he took out a small thing wrapped in an old flannel handkerchief. He unwound it without looking. It was a glass tube the length of his hand, sealed at both ends, half full of clear liquid, with feathered white crystals drifting in the bottom like the inside of a snowed-on window, a storm glass. His grandfather had carried it across the ocean from a fishing town in Norway, and Anton Vangen had set it on the kitchen sill of the first sod house ever raised on this ground. The old man's voice came to him the way it always did. The storm glass doesn't tell you the weather, Reidar. It tells you to pay attention. He turned it once in the cold light. The crystals had begun to climb the inside wall, faint and feathery, the way they did before, something the sky hadn't announced yet. He wrapped it back in the flannel and put it away and finished his coffee, and below him the trucks of 50 good men kept crawling toward a number that would barely cover their seed. Reidar Vangen had not simply refused to sell. That was the part the valley didn't yet understand. He had doubled down on his refusal in a way that would have stopped their hearts. All through that previous summer, while his neighbors were trading in for new pickups and bolting GPS guidance onto their combines, Reidar had been driving back and forth to the First National Bank of Tollerud. He had not borrowed for new equipment. He had hired a crew out of Fargo and put up 3 towering bins of corrugated steel behind his machine shed, each one rising 70 feet above the flat and rated to hold 100,000 bushels, with aeration floors and computerized moisture sensors and sweep augers that were commercial grade and built to last. For all 6 weeks of that July and August construction, Casper Lund had worked alongside the crew as Reidar's second set of eyes, learning the grade of every concrete footing and the torque on every bolt, because Reidar had told him to learn it. If these bins are going to stand for 50 years, Reidar had said, the man who runs them ought to know them the way you know your own hand. Casper was the kind of young man who took an instruction like that and did not forget it. He had come to Reidar 3 springs earlier with a single page of work history and a handshake that told more than the page. He was 22 with a quietness that was not shyness. It was the quietness of someone who had learned early that the world does not reward complaint, and had drawn his own conclusions from that lesson and kept them to himself. His people had farmed down by Hillsborough, a good place, good ground, and then the cycle had turned, and the notes had come due in the wrong sequence, and his father had spent the fall of Casper's 11th year watching strangers walk through the barn, appraising what the cattle were worth. The auctioneer had come in March. Casper did not talk about the day of the auction, but there were things he did and did not do that told its story without words. He was meticulous with equipment. He did not own careful with other men's tools in a way that most young men aren't. And he had never once in 3 years asked to borrow against his next paycheck. Reidar had hired him in the same hour he'd met him, which was not how he usually did things, and Solveig had raised an eyebrow when she heard. "You hired a stranger in an afternoon," she said. "That's not like you." He reminded me of someone I needed to help, Reidar had said, and she hadn't pressed it because she knew from his face that it was true, and she knew from his posture that the someone was not somebody else. They were commercial monoliths standing on a family farm, 3 silver giants on the black ground, and until this October they had stood entirely empty. What the valley did not know, what Solveig herself had not fully let herself believe until she signed beside him at the bank, was how he had paid for them. The loan officer had needed collateral the equipment couldn't cover, and Reidar had laid down the one thing no Vangen had ever borrowed against in 3 generations. The home quarter, the first 160 acres, the ground where the old sod house had stood, where his grandfather had broken the prairie with a single bottom plough and a team of oxen, where his father was born in a back bedroom, and where Reidar himself had taken his first steps. He had mortgaged the soul of the farm to build steel boxes to hold corn nobody wanted to buy. He had not told a living person outside that bank office, not the men at church, not Casper. He had told only Solveig, and he had told her with his hand flat on the kitchen table and his eyes down, and she had gone very still and very quiet, and then she had reached across and put her hand over his. That afternoon, while the Auger roared and a golden river of corn poured up into the top of Bin 3, a midnight blue King Ranch pickup came up the gravel approach in a long boil of dust and stopped where it had no business stopping, square in the working yard. Out stepped Garrett Sloan. Sloan farmed better than 8,000 acres across 3 counties, which made him the biggest operator anyone in Tollerud had ever heard of. He treated dirt like a man on a trading floor treats us green, pressed khakis even at harvest, a branded quilted vest, a tablet in his hand that he checked the way other men check their watch, the Chicago Board of Trade glowing across it in green and red. He was not yet 50, and he moved like a man who had decided long ago that the slow people of this valley were simply furniture. He had to walk around. The valley had watched Garrett Sloane arrive 6 years earlier with capital behind him that nobody local could quite account for, and it had watched him lease and buy and consolidate with the efficiency of a machine designed specifically for that purpose. He was not from here. He had grown up in Fargo and studied agricultural business at a university in Minnesota, and he talked about farming the way a man talks about a sector, which was a word the older men at Bergstrom's counter had no use for. He drove the King Ranch because it was the largest thing in the King Ranch line, and he flew to Chicago twice a year to sit in rooms where the prices that governed this valley were set by men who had never touched the soil they were pricing. There were farmers who respected him, and farmers who resented him, and a number who did both in alternating seasons, depending on whether his shadow was currently crossing their fence line. He had not made a single enemy he knew of by name. He had made several he didn't know of, because when a man expands efficiently enough, some of the contracting is done by people too tired to fight it. He had looked at Reidar Vangen's 3 new bins all summer from the road that ran past the east section. He had done the math. He had not stopped then. He was here now because the math had changed, and the man at First National had mentioned the home quarter over a round of golf, and Garrett Sloane did not miss an opportunity that the arithmetic had already identified for him. You're building a mausoleum for your corn, Reidar. He had to shout it over the roar of the ogre, and he smiled while he shouted, white and even and entirely without warmth. Reidar did not turn around. He stood watching the grain climb the spout, his arms folded, his cap pulled low. I'm building a bank vault, Garrett. At $3.15 a bushel, you've gone simple. I dumped 60,000 this morning, took my lumps paid, the credit line down to where it sleeps at night. That's the business. You sit on this much grain through a North Dakota winter, and the interest alone will hollow you out. Never mind the shrink. Never mind what happens when one of those bins sweats and your corn turns to a black brick. You're betting the whole place on a spring rally that has never once come when a man needed it to. Reidar finally turned and looked at him slow, the way you'd turn to look at weather. His face gave away nothing. My grandfather told me something a long time ago, Garrett. When the bin is empty, the buyer makes the rules. When the bin is full, I do. Sloane laughed, a short dry sound with no bottom to it. Eldon Breck told me you borrowed against your home quarter to put these tin cans up. Reidar, if that board doesn't pop by, March Eldon owns your grandfather's ground. And when it goes to the courthouse steps, I'll be standing there first in line with a paddle in my hand. I want you to know that now, so there's no surprise in it later. He climbed back into the King Ranch, and the threat hung in the cold air a long time after the dust of him had settled, longer than dust has any right to hang. Inside the farmhouse, the air was a different kind of cold. Solveig Vangen sat at the kitchen table with the blue light of her laptop on her face, and the worry set in her the way frost sits in a fence post all the way through. She was 56. She had taught 4th grade in Tollerud for 22 years before her hands got too tired of chalk, and she still corrected a man's grammar by reflex, and she still kept a teacher's clean ledger of every dollar that came in and went out of this farm. The screen in front of her was a sea of red. She did not look up when Reidar came in smelling of diesel and dust. Eldon called again. He wanted to know if we'd settled any tickets at the elevator yet. I went to the sink and worked the orange soap into the grease in the creases of his hands. I told him we were still combining the east sections. Reidar, I lied to a man we've sat in the pew behind for 20 years. It wasn't a lie. We haven't settled anything. He dried his hands on the towel by the stove. Because you haven't sold a single kernel. She closed the laptop gently, which from her was louder than slamming it. The operating note is $200,000, and it's due the 1st of March. If we don't have it, they take the equipment, and then they take the 400 acres, and after that, her voice didn't rise. It just thinned. After that, they take the home quarter, Reidar, because you put it up. Every other family in this valley is cashing out and sleeping at night. Every other family is being robbed at the door and thanking the man who did it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and the wood creaked under him, and he reached across the cold table and took both her hands the way he had at the bank. But it was what she said next that turned the whole night around. "I know they are," she said. "I know the price is wrong." He looked up at her. She drew the laptop back toward herself and opened it and turned it so he could see, and there was no red there now. There were maps, river gauges, a long graph stepping downward like a staircase into a cellar. "You think you're the only one who's been driving the county counting small ears," she said. "I've been reading too, all summer. While you were watching the dirt, I was watching the rest of the world. Look, the Paraná River, it's the artery that carries half of South America's grain to the sea. It's the lowest it's been in 70 years. The barges are running half-loaded out of Rosario because the channel won't float them full. There's a La Niña pattern setting up over the southern hemisphere that the long-range models won't shut up about. And there are wildcat dock workers in Brazil who haven't been paid right since spring." Reidar sat very still. For 20 years he had thought of himself as the one who read the land, the one with the long sight, the stubborn old man who knew better. And here across his own kitchen table, in a circle of laptop light, was the truth of it. The eyes behind his decision had been hers the whole time. She had been the one paying attention. "You never said. You never asked," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only 22 years of a thing finally getting said. You decided it was a feeling in your gut. It was never your gut, Reidar. It was my reading. I just let you carry it like it was yours, because that's how you needed to carry it. I took the storm glass from his pocket and unwound the handkerchief and set the little tube upright on the table between them in the lamplight, the white crystals climbing. "Then we carry it together from here," he said. "No more secrets at this table." She looked at the glass a long moment. The crystals had risen higher than he'd seen them all month, feathered and reaching the way they did before the kind of weather that didn't show on any radar yet. "And if we're wrong," she said quietly, "if the river fills and the board sits dead and the price drops to $2 by February." He looked out the black window at the 3 silver giants standing against the last gray light. "Then I'll own the most expensive bird feeders in the state of North Dakota," he said, and for the first time in a week she almost smiled. The feeling went on for 9 more days, truck after truck up the approach, and the auger never stopped its golden roar, and one by one the bins drank their fill. Bin 1, bin 2, and finally bin 3. 280,000 bushels of yellow corn sealed up against the coming cold. Casper Lund worked beside Reidar 14 hours a day, with the same steady care he'd brought to those bin footings all summer, and Reidar had never once wished he'd taken a different man. On the last evening, when the spout finally went dry and the sweep on Bean 3 swallowed its last few bushels, the two of them stood at the base of the steel in the blue dusk breath smoking, while the aeration fans hummed their first long song through all that grain. "That's a lot of corn to sit on, boss," Casper said. "It is. What if you're wrong about it?" Reidar took the storm glass out and held it up so the boy could see the crystals inside. He didn't explain it. He just turned it once in the cold light. "A man my grandfather's age told him, 'This glass doesn't tell you the weather,' he said. 'It tells you to pay attention.' Most men sell their corn in October because they're afraid of the winter. They never find out what the winter was actually going to do." He wound the flannel back around it. "We're going to find out, Casper." 3 days later, the valley got its first hard freeze, and a skin of ice closed over the sloughs, and the King Ranch did not come back up the approach. But word came instead. Eldon Breck called the house and asked again about tickets, and Solveig did not lie this time, and the silence on the banker's end of the line was the silence of a friend doing arithmetic he didn't want to do. And then, on a still grey morning at the very end of October, Reidar walked out to the bins with his coffee the way he did every dawn now, to listen to the fence and put his hand against the cold steel and feel for trouble. He climbed the ladder of bin 2 and lifted the top hatch to look at his grain in the early light. He stood there a long moment. Then he came down faster than a man. His age should come down a frozen ladder, and he went into the house and woke Solveig, and his voice was lower and stranger than she had heard it in 30 years of marriage. "Get your coat," he said. "There's something in the grain, and I think we put it there ourselves." The hatch had shown him snow, not the clean dry dust he expected of his own corn, but a fur of frost, clinging to the underside of the steel roof, and below it, rising up out of one shoulder of the yellow mountain, a thread of warmth that had no business living in a bin in late October. He had smelled it before he understood it. Faint, sweetish, raw, the first breath of something fermenting in the dark. Solveig climbed the outside ladder behind him with her coat thrown over her nightclothes, and when she reached the hatch and looked down into the bin, she did not say anything for a moment. The fans were already running. They had been running for days, and still the frost grew on the roof like a thing alive. "That's our own water," she said finally, "coming up out of the grain and freezing where it can't get out." He knew it was. That was the part that sat in him like a stone all the way back down the ladder. A man could blame the market, the bank, the weather, Garrett Sloane, and the whole turning world, but the moisture in that bin had gone in there under his own auger on his own watch, and now it was looking for a place to do its damage. He spent the first day fighting it the way a stubborn man fights anything with more of the same. He ran the fans harder. He opened the roof vents until the wind moaned through them. He climbed up twice more to look and smell and tell himself it was holding. By the third climb, the sweet smell had thickened into something closer to vinegar, and a single sensor cable was reading 2 degrees warmer than its neighbors, and he stood at the top of bin 2 in the wind and understood that he did not actually know what he was doing. He had built the finest storage on any family farm in the valley, and he had never once had to save a bin that was trying to kill itself. It was Solveig who said the name, Sig Halvorsen. He ran the Tollerud elevator 40 years before Kurt's father ever did. If anybody alive knows how to walk a hot bin back from the edge, it's him. He's pushing 85. His head still works. Call him. The old man answered on the second ring, like he'd been sitting by the phone since the Eisenhower administration, waiting for somebody to need him again. He listened to Reidar's account without a single interruption, which was its own small mercy, and then he asked 3 questions. What was the corn testing when it went in? How deep was the warm cable reading? And was the smell sweet or sour yet? And on the answer to the third one, he was quiet a beat too long. Sweet, you've got time. Sour, you're already late. I'll come look at it. Don't run those fans wide open. Another night, thinking it's helping. Air with no plan just feeds the fire. He arrived the next morning in a rust-eaten Ford that had no right to still be moving, a small bent man in a barn coat 2 sizes too big, and he walked the bays of the 3 bins with one ungloved hand trailing along the cold steel, like he was taking the temperature of a horse. He did not take over. That was the thing Reidar would remember about him later. He never once touched a switch himself. He stood at the bottom of bin 2 and looked up the 70 feet of it and told Reidar and Casper exactly what to do, and then he let them do it wrong twice before he corrected them, because a man only learns a bin by getting his own hands cold on it. You can't cool the whole thing, he said, working a toothpick across his gums. You cool the core, or you lose it. You've got to pull grain out of the center, unload her down a 3rd breakup, that hot column, let the air find a path through where it's packed tight. It's like a fever. You don't argue with the whole body. You go find the infection and you cut it out. For the better part of 2 weeks they cored bin 2. They ran a wagon under the center draw and pulled the heart out of it a few thousand bushels at a time, and the grain that came out of the middle was the thing that broke something small in Reidar each time the gate opened, darkened, clumped, smelling of warm earth and spoiled cider corn that had been worth money in September and was worth a discount and an apology now. And it was while they were coring on a flat grey afternoon with the wagon half full of ruined grain that Reidar found the why of it. Solveig kept the drying logs. She kept everything the way she'd kept attendance for 22 years, in a clean hand with the date in the left margin, and that afternoon, at the kitchen table, she ran her finger down the moisture column and stopped. This load. The night of the 12th, it went in at 18.5. He came and looked over her shoulder. 15 was the number. 15 was the only number a man put corn into a sealed bin at if he wanted to see it again. 18.5 was water with a little corn in it. 18.5 was the seed of every bad smell in that bin. He stood there a long time, with his hand on the back of her chair, and then he remembered the 12th. The 12th had been the night the dryer's burner kept kicking out in the wind, and he'd sent Casper to babysit it alone because he himself had been up 40 hours and could not see straight, and somewhere in the small black hours the boy had shut it down early and run the wet load in rather than let the trucks back up behind a cold dryer. He found Casper in the machine, shed greasing the wagon's hitch, and the boy looked up at him, and then looked back down at his work too fast, and Reidar understood that Casper had already done the same arithmetic days ago alone, and had been carrying it. "The wet load was mine," the boy said to the hitch. The night the burner quit, I didn't want the line to back up. I thought I'd run the fans on it harder and it'd be fine. He set the grease gun down very carefully. I cost you that bin, boss. You can take it out of my pay. You can take it out of the truck you promised me. I'll understand. Here was the moment, and Reidar felt the shape of it. He could lay the whole ruined bin on this 22-year-old and be right to do it. The numbers said so, and he stood there in the cold shed and thought about a flatbed in a yard down by Hillsborough, and an auctioneer's voice and a family watching from a borrowed car, and he understood that there were two kinds of men a hard winter could make of you, and only one of them was worth being. You didn't cost me a bin, Casper. He said it plain. I cost myself a bin when I sent a kid who'd been awake 2 days to run a burner alone in the wind. That's on the man who made the schedule. You hear me? He waited until the boy looked up. We're not the kind of outfit that feeds its own people to the auger to save face. Now grease the other side and let's go pull the rest of that fever out of bin 2. The boy didn't say anything. He didn't trust his voice, and Reidar didn't make him use it. He just nodded once hard and bent back to the hitch, and that was the end of it, and also somehow the beginning of something between them that hadn't been there before. The valley in its way had begun to notice. Nobody said a word to his face. That was not how things were done out here, but on a Sunday, the propane company's truck came up the approach and topped the dryer tank and the yard tank both, and when Reidar called to ask about the bill, the girl in the office said it had been taken care of, and would say nothing more, and he stood holding the phone and knew it had been somebody in the third pew who'd watched him not sing the closing hymn because his mind was in a bin. A foil-covered casserole appeared on the porch rail one frozen morning with no note, then a second one, then a pan of bars from the Lindqvist sisters, who hadn't spoken to a Vangen since a property line dispute in 1991, and one black morning during the coring, 2 young farmers, Reidar barely knew the Aberg boy, and a kid who rented ground out past the elevator, simply turned up in the yard at 5:30 with their own grain shovels and worked beside Casper until noon and left before he could find the words to thank them and would not take coffee and said only that they'd heard he was short-handed. It was not money. None of it was money, and the money was what he needed, but it was the valley's older language, the one underneath the gossip, the one that said, "We see you out here, even if we think you're a fool." And slowly the fever broke. The cable that had read warm came back down to match its neighbors. The sour smell thinned and then was gone, and the corn coming up out of bins 1 and 3, when he probed them, was bright and dry and sweet, the way it was supposed to be. They had saved 2 bins clean. Bin 2 had cost him 20,000 bushels of it, would have to go to Kurt at the elevator, branded as damaged grain, sold for whatever the discount left of it, which was very little, but 2 bins out of 3 stood sound and sealed, and on the evening they ran the last of the cord grain off and shut the wagon gate. Sig Halvorsen climbed into his terrible Ford and rolled the window down. "You did all right," he said. He didn't smile, but something in the creases around his eyes did. Most men panic and dump the whole thing the day the cable spikes. You kept your head and you cut out the rot, and you saved what was good. He put the Ford in gear. Your grandfather'd have done it the same. Or he paused, and a strange weight came into the old man's voice that Reidar didn't understand yet, or he'd have wanted to. Reidar didn't ask him what he meant. He should have. He'd think about that later, too. The wooden box was how he found out. It had come across the ocean, holding the storm glass, a flat little case of dark pine with a sliding lid worn pale by a century of thumbs, and the family had always kept odd small things in it, a thimble, a watch that didn't run the deed copies nobody trusted to a drawer. Reidar went into it that night looking for the desiccant packets he kept for the monitors. His fingers found paper at the bottom that he didn't know folded small and gone soft as cloth with age. The first sheet was a notice. He read the top of it and felt the floor of the kitchen drop an inch. Foreclosure, notice of sheriff's sale, Vangen Anton. The legal description that followed was ground he had walked every day of his life, and the date in the corner was 1985. The second sheet was a letter in his grandfather's hand, the old country slant of it, written to Reidar's father, and apparently never sent. He read it twice. Then he set it down, and sat with both hands flat on the table, the way he did when something was too big to be picked up all at once. He had grown up on the story that Anton Vangen broke the prairie and held it through everything and handed it down clean. That was the story carved into the man like the lines in Reidar's own face. The letter told a different one. In the fall of 1984, with interest at 18% and the elevator price collapsing, Anton had panicked. He had hauled every bushel he owned to town and sold it at the bottom of the bottom, terrified, sure the price would go lower, sure the bank would call the note, and the note got called anyway because the bottom price didn't cover it, and the spring rally came in April for the man who'd held, and Anton Vangen stood at the courthouse steps in the summer of 1985 and watched his life auctioned in quarter sections to younger men with cash. He had bought back the only thing he could afford to buy back. The home quarter, the 160 acres with the sod house ground on it. He had borrowed against his own name at his age to do it, and he had carried that debt to his grave, and the letter ended with a single line that Reidar read over and over until the words stopped meaning anything and started meaning everything. Don't ever sell because you're afraid. Fear is the only thing that ever took this farm. Make your boy promise me. I should have held. Solveig found him there an hour later with the lamp burned low and the letter in front of him, and he handed it to her without a word, and she read it standing up with one hand rising slowly to her mouth. That's why she said, not the market, not Sloane, this. He couldn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice had gravel in it that hadn't been there. He told my father and my father told me, and neither of them ever showed me this. They just said, a Vangen holds his crop. I thought it was pride. He looked at the storm glass on the sill, the crystals in it climbing in the lamplight. It was never pride. It was him standing on those courthouse steps, asking me not to do the thing he did. He had mortgaged the home quarter to build the bins, the same ground the old man had bled to buy back. He had bet the exact acre of his grandfather's shame on the exact lesson of his grandfather's regret. And until this night he had not even known he was doing it. January came down on the valley like a closing hand. The cold went past anything that had a number worth saying out loud. The board crept to 335 and stuck there, the world still convinced the bins of America were overflowing, the world still wrong and not yet caring that it was. The electric bill for the fans came, and Solveig set it face down on the table without comment, which was how he knew it was bad. The march toward the 1st of March became a thing he could feel in his chest, in the dark. And then at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, with the thermometer reading 30 below, the bedside monitor went off. It was a cable 4, bean 2, the one they'd cored, 85 degrees halfway down the core climbing. I was into his coveralls before Solveig was fully awake. They'd missed a pocket. Somewhere in the heart of the bin, a column of grain they hadn't reached was fermenting, throwing heat, and if it ran away from him in this cold, it would turn the whole center to a black welded brick, or worse, would smolder and find air and burn from the inside out. The wind outside was a living thing with teeth. He threw the breakers and the fans roared and shook the steel, hauling 30 below air up through the floor to fight the fire in the middle, but he had to see it, and seeing it meant the ladder. 70 feet of frost-glazed rung, bolted to the outside of the bin in the dark, in a wind that wanted him off it. His gloves slid on the first rung, and he stopped and breathed and looked up the black height of the thing, and behind him at the bottom Casper had appeared from the bunk room, half-dressed, shouting up into the wind that he'd go. He was younger. Let him go. Stay on the ground, Reidar called down. If I come off this thing, somebody on the ground's got to be alive to call for help. He started to climb. His grandfather's voice climbed with him. The storm glass doesn't tell you the weather. He went up into the dark, one frozen rung at a time, his cheeks burning, his breath tearing away sideways, and one missed grip the whole long way down to the concrete. He reached the hatch and threw it back, and the smell came up at him out of the black, and it was not sweet, and it was not even the vinegar of before. It was sour and hot, and mean the smell of grain eating itself, and he put his light down into the well of it, and could not even see the hot column buried 30 feet under the surface, only the deadly rain of his own corn's breath freezing and falling off the steel above it. They cored it again. There was nothing else to do. In the deep of that January burning electricity, he was billing to a future he wasn't sure he'd have. He pulled the heart out of bin 2 a second time and hauled 20,000 bushels of scorched, discolored corn to the Tollerud co-op, and watched Kurt Algren weigh it in and stamp the ticket damaged and pay him a price that was hardly a price at all. And Kurt, who was not a cruel man, only a talkative one, made sure by sundown that everyone in the valley knew Reidar Vangen was hauling rotten corn to town in the dead of winter. I told you, Garrett Sloane said at the diner, holding court over a plate of eggs to anyone who'd listen, and several who were only there for the coffee tried to outsmart the market. Now the old fool's paying by the kilowatt hour to drive his own funeral. He'll be cleaned out before the frost's off the ground. What Sloane did not say at the diner, what only his own banker knew, was that the great empire of 8,000 acres was a great deal more mortgage than land, that he had dumped his own crop in October, not out of wisdom, but out of necessity, because the interest on 3 counties of leveraged ground does not wait for a man's pride, and that every morning Garrett Sloane checked the green and red on his tablet. He was checking whether he would survive the year himself. The 1st of March was 2 weeks out, when Eldon Breck drove up the approach himself, rather than make the call. They stood in the machine shed out of the wind, 2 men who had passed the peace to each other in church for 20 years, and the banker turned his hat in his hands. I've run out of runway, Reidar. The committee went over your file. There's no payment, the board's flat, and now there's talk all over the county about damaged grain. He couldn't quite look up. If that note isn't paid the 1st of March, I have to file on the 400 acres, and you and I both know what's pledged behind the 400. I'd be filing on your grandfather's ground, Reidar. I don't want to be the man who does that, but the man who does it is going to be me. There's a drought breaking South America, in half Reidar said. The Paraná can't float a loaded barge. Brazil's about to come apart at the docks. The supply isn't there, Eldon. The whole market's trading on a lie. I can't take a river in Argentina to my committee, the banker said, and for the first time his voice cracked out of its calm. I need a number with your name and a dollar sign in front of it. Sell the corn. Even where it sits, it covers the note. You'll lose your shirt on the storage, but you'll keep the land. Take the loss like a man and live to plant in April. If I sell now, I prove every one of them right, Reidar said, low and stubborn and tired, all the way to the bone. I prove that the only thing a farmer's allowed to do is bleed out quietly. Give me to the 1st of March. You have to the 1st of March, Eldon said, and put his hat back on, because that's the day the law runs out, not because I'm giving you anything. He stopped at the shed door. I'm sorry, Reidar. I mean that more than I've ever meant anything I had to say in that suit. That same evening, as if he'd been parked down the road, waiting for the banker's taillights, the King Ranch came up the approach a final time, and this time Garrett Sloane did not gloat. He stood on the porch in the cold, and he looked for once like a man doing arithmetic of his own. You're cornered, Reidar. The bin's a wreck, the bank's at your throat, and your wife looks like she hasn't slept since Thanksgiving. He took a folded paper from inside his vest. One offer, tonight. I buy the 400 acres cash before the bank can file. Enough to clear the note and put a little cushion under you. You keep the house. You keep the bins. You walk out from under the whole thing alive. The number on the page was a fifth below what the ground was worth. It was a number a man writes down only when he is standing over someone he's decided is already falling. You want my grandfather's land for the price of a man who can't say no, Reidar said. I'm throwing you a rope, Sloane shot back, and there was something almost desperate in it, something that wasn't only greed. Pride doesn't pay a note, Reidar. Half of what I own is the bank's too. The difference between you and me is I knew it in October. Sign the paper. Reidar took the contract out of his hand. He did not read it. He folded it once more the way the old man's letter had been folded, soft and small, and then he tore it across and across again and let the quarters of it go from his fingers into the wind, where they skated away over the frozen yard and were gone. Off my porch, Garrett. Sloane zipped his vest to the throat. His face had closed like a gate. Suit yourself, old man. I'll buy it at the courthouse for less. And when I'm standing on those steps with the paddle, you remember I came out here in the cold and offered you a way to keep it. The truck went down the approach, and its red lights shrank and were swallowed by the flat dark, and the front door opened behind Reidar, and he knew before he turned that Solveig had heard all of it. The tears on her face caught the porch light, but it was her voice that undid him, because it wasn't angry, it was past angry, into something worse. He gave us a way out. She wasn't shouting, that was the terrible part. She had no shouting left. The corn is rotting in the ground you mortgaged, the price is dead, the bank is 2 weeks from the courthouse, and you tore it up and threw it in the snow. She wrapped her arms around herself in the doorway. You promised me no more secrets at that table, so tell me the truth right now. How are we not losing this farm? What in God's name are you still waiting for? He opened his mouth to give her the certainty he had carried all winter like a coal in his fist. And for the first time since the night the trucks turned around, there was nothing in his hand. He stood on his own porch under the cold stars with the woman he loved asking him a fair question, and the storm glass on the window sill behind her throwing back the lamplight, its crystals risen higher than he had seen them in his life, feathered and reaching toward a weather no instrument on earth had named yet, and Reidar Vangen, who always had an answer, said nothing at all. He did not go inside. He sat down on the top porch step in the 30 below dark, his coat still on, and he let the cold come in through the fabric, the way it always eventually did, and he stayed there until the kitchen light went out and the house was dark. The storm glass on the sill caught only starlight now, a faint sealed gleam in the window glass, and the crystals in it were invisible, but he knew where they stood. He had known them his whole life, without knowing what they were waiting for. He had no answer for Solveig, because the answer had always required certainty, and somewhere between the porch and the porch step he had set certainty down. What remained was something simpler and worse, he still believed. He had nothing left to prove it with, he just believed. A man can be wrong and still believe. He sat with that for a long time in the dark, and then he went inside and did not disturb her sleeping, and lay on his side of the bed with his eyes open until the gray came back into the sky. The last days of February passed with the slowness of things that are counting down to something that hasn't happened yet. He worked in the machine shed because the machine shed was the one place where a problem had a tool that fit it. He greased fittings he'd greased in October. He bled the air lines on the compressor. He ordered parts he didn't need from a catalog he'd had for 3 years. His hands moved and his mind chewed the same material over and over and produced nothing new. On a Thursday morning, Casper came into the shed and stood by the workbench and waited for Reidar to look up, and the look on the boy's face was one Reidar recognized, because it was the face of a man trying to find a way to say something that shames him just by needing to be said. My landlords had enough of my explanation, Reidar. 2 weeks' wages. I know what the account looks like. I know there's nothing in it. I can't avoid asking any more. He set the wrench down. He did not make Casper stand in it any longer than it took to cross the shed and lift the keys off the nail by the door, the spare set for the old Chevy he'd hauled with since before Casper was in school. That truck's worth more than I owe you. Take it to Hilmer at the lot in Larrymore, and he'll give you fair money for it, and the rest is for your patience. He held out the keys. Casper looked at them the way a person looks at something being given when they know what it cost. I'm not taking your truck, boss. It's not mine anymore. Take the keys, Casper. The boy took them. He folded his hand around them and stood there, and Reidar went back to the workbench because there was nothing to say that wasn't already in the keys, and they both understood that. The news that Thursday afternoon was that the situation in South America had provisionally eased. That was the word the agricultural correspondent used sitting in front of a map. Provisionally. Rain had fallen in the Mato Grosso. A gauge on the Paraná had risen 4 centimeters. 2 freighters that had been anchored for 11 days began moving toward the port. The corn futures for the next morning's open were projected flat at 340, which the man on the screen called stabilizing, and which Reidar sat in the kitchen and understood to mean the rally was not coming. He drove to the co-op the next morning. He did not get out of the truck. He sat in the gravel lot for a long time with the engine running and watched the birds working the spilled grain around the elevator pit and thought about his grandfather sitting on courthouse steps, and about a letter that ended with 3 words, and about what it costs a man to be wrong in public versus what it costs him to be wrong in private, and what the difference is, if there is any. He could walk in and sell at 340 and cover the bank note and live a diminished life on ground that was still his. He drove home without getting out of the truck. He did not have a reason he could defend. He had only the thing that had been true since October sitting in him like a bone. That evening Solveig made soup, and they ate it at the kitchen table without talking about any of it. She had not stopped speaking to him, which was the thing he'd feared most after the porch. She was simply waiting for him to be right or wrong, and she had decided to wait without making it smaller than it was. He thought she was the bravest person he'd ever known. He didn't say so. He thought she already knew. He fell asleep after supper in the chair by the window. He almost never slept before midnight any more, and the sleep took him without warning, deep and black, and he did not know anything that happened in the house for the next 4 hours. He did not know that Solveig waited until his breathing went slow and even, and then she went to the small spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, the one he had never asked about because it looked like a grocery list, and she opened it to a page near the back, where a phone number was written under the heading NPB Purchasing Duty Line. She had found the number 6 weeks earlier, while cross-referencing the plant's quarterly delivery manifest against the rail freight schedules she'd been watching. She had written it down and said nothing, the way she had said nothing about the Paraná reports and the La Niña models and the dock worker wage dispute, because Reidar did not need more information to believe. He had believed since before she showed him the maps. What she had been doing all this time was building the floor under his belief quietly, in case it needed one. She made the call from the kitchen phone while he slept. A duty manager answered. She told him who she was. She told him what she had. She told him the rail situation in Illinois had been degrading for 10 days, and that if he was running on just-in-time inventory, he would feel it before the weekend. She did not ask for anything. She only said, if your deliveries don't arrive, call this farm before you call anyone else. She left the number and said good night and hung up and went to bed. She did not tell him in the morning. February 28th came in overcast and still the kind of quiet that sits on top of something. He spent the morning doing nothing useful. He checked the bins out of habit, all 3 of them, running his hand along the steel in the cold, listening to the fans. What was left in them, a little over 260,000 bushels of dry sound corn, hummed in the grain the way a full thing hums, heavy and patient and uncomplaining. In the afternoon, Eldon Breck called the house and asked quietly if Reidar would come to the bank in the morning. The papers would be on the desk, if there was money good. If not, they would handle the rest with as much dignity as the law allowed. He was sorry to ask. He would always be sorry. Reidar said he understood and thanked him, and set the phone back in the cradle without raising his voice. After supper, they sat on the couch and Solveig found the agricultural news channel, and they watched without speaking. The futures board crawled across the bottom of the screen. 340, 342, back to 340. The correspondent was talking about spring planting projections in central Illinois, which meant everything was fine, which meant nothing had broken yet. Then the anchor turned from the camera to his earpiece with the small arrested motion that every news watcher over 60 has learned to read. The words came out in the careful shorthand of a man assembling a bulletin while he spoke it. A wildcat labor action at the port of Paranaguá, Brazil, not an easing, but a full shutdown. Every grain freighter in the harbor anchored. The number of vessels was still being confirmed, but it was significant. Simultaneously, a deep freeze event across the upper Midwest had descended faster than models projected, and rail switching yards from Fargo to Galesburg were reporting equipment failures, frozen switches, derailed cars on secondary lines, ethanol plants operating on just-in-time corn delivery were here the anchor paused a bit, beginning to report critical inventory concerns. The futures board on the screen had not moved. The Chicago board was closed. It would not open for hours. The number at the bottom still said 340 and would keep saying it until morning, because the system that set it was asleep, and outside, in the frozen dark, the actual world had already moved without asking permission. Reidar leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the bottom of the screen. Solveig sat beside him and said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she watched his face, not the television. At 5:20 in the morning, March the 1st, the day Eldon's papers were sitting on a mahogany desk 14 miles away. The phone rang. Reidar was already in the kitchen. He had not slept again. He had the coffee on and the radio going low, and the storm glass on the table in front of him, which he had taken down from the seal in the night, and simply held for a while, the glass warm from his hands, the crystals in it finally, at some point in the dark hours, beginning very slowly to fall. He picked up the phone on the second ring. The voice on the other end was the sound of a man who had been awake longer than Reidar had. Clipped, fast, running on caffeine, and the specific terror of a man whose machinery is about to go cold. My name is Desmond Vale. I'm the head of purchasing at Northern Plains Bioenergy up in Harrisonville. I believe you know why I'm calling. Reidar looked at Solveig, who had come into the kitchen doorway in her robe. Her face was entirely still, and in the stillness of it he saw something that had not been there the night before, a knowledge awaiting, and he understood in that moment not everything, but enough. She had been here before him. The floor she had built was under his feet right now. "Tell me what you need, Mr. Vale," the man told him. 14 hours of fuel left in his silos. Rail deliveries sitting frozen in a switchyard 2 states away. $5 million to shut down and restart his fermenters if it came to that. The satellite imagery had shown 3 bins on Reidar's property, and he needed to know if they were full. 2 of them are, Reidar said, roughly 260,000 bushels, dry tested, clean. I need everything you have, Vangen, today. Name a price. This was the moment his grandfather had not had. The moment Anton Vangen had burned through in a panic, hauling to a buyer who set the number and kept the difference and let the farmer think he'd been treated fair. This was the exact moment from the other side of it, and it felt exactly the way his grandfather's letter had made him think it would, like standing on solid ground in a place where a man had once fallen through. The board closed at 3:40, Reidar said. I know what the board is. I'll pay $580, basis premium cash, wire transfer the second your first truck crosses my scale. There was a silence that was not hesitation. It was the silence of a man letting a number sit in the air long enough to know its own weight. 610, Reidar said. 610, the voice went flat, almost offended. That is robbery. You're looking at $5 million in restart costs, Reidar said. I don't think the number is the thing bothering you. A longer silence. The sound of a man breathing through an equation. Fine. 6:10. My first trucks are staged 20 miles out. I can have them moving in 40 minutes. You better have that auger warmed. Send them. He hung the phone up and turned around. Solveig was still in the doorway. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands, his cold, rough hands, and he kissed her forehead the way a man kisses something he almost lost, which is differently than any other way. You called them, he said. She looked up at him. I called the duty line 6 weeks ago. Left them our number. I told them the rails would go before the strike did. She was not boasting. She was explaining the way she'd explained attendance records for 20 years, matter of fact and without ceremony. He held her face a moment longer. I thought I was the one with the long sight, he finally said. I know you did. She put her hands over his and did not move them. I let you think it because you needed to carry it. But Reidar, she waited until he met her eyes. I need you to know. It was never just your gut. It was us. It was always us. He could not speak. He just nodded once, slowly, and she nodded back, and then he grabbed his coat. County Road 14 had not seen a morning like it since harvest. The first truck came up the approach before 6, a set of headlights in the dark, resolving into a grain hauler out of Harrisonville, and behind it another and then another, stretching back into the dark as far as Reidar could see. He and Casper fired the sweep augers on bins 1 and 3, and the Golden River started, and every time a truck loaded and pulled out, another rolled in under the spout without a gap, a chain that ran without stopping while the sun came up red over the flat and turned the steel of the bins the color of embers. Casper worked the auger controls without being asked and without needing direction. He watched the grain flow with the look of a man who has understood something that took longer to understand than it should have, and Reidar watched him for a moment between trucks and saw his father in him, which was not his father at all, but the thing that fathers are supposed to pass down, arriving finally in the right place. At 8:30, a familiar vehicle came up the approach driving too fast, fishtailing on the frost, and stopped hard in the yard. Garrett Sloane got out, moving nothing like his usual pressed khaki confidence. He was unshaven. He was looking at the trucks the way a man looks at a board that has already closed. What is this? What in the hell is this? Northern Plains Bioenergy called my operation an hour ago. I tried to sell them everything in the co-op contract, and they told me. He stopped. His voice dropped. They said the quota was filled. Reidar pulled the lever and cut the grain flow for a moment, and the sudden quiet made everything audible. The wind, the idling trucks, the sound of Garrett Sloane arriving at a number he had not wanted to reach. Filled it this morning. Sloane stood there. Something in his face rearranged itself into something Reidar had not expected, not fury and not quite grief, something closer to the look of a man who has been right about himself in a way that cost him everything. I had everything in co-op contracts, Sloane said quietly. October prices. You took your lumps, Reidar said. Paid the credit line down. That's the business. He said it without venom, because there was none left in him for it. He meant it the way a season means things not cruelly, just finally. Sloane looked at him for a long moment. Then he got back in the King Ranch and drove down the approach slowly this time. And Reidar watched him go, and he thought that a man who farms 8,000 acres with someone else's money is no more free than a man farming 400 with his own, and that there are different ways to lose a thing, and losing it quick in October is only one of them. By 4 in the afternoon the bins were empty, the last truck pulled out, and the auger wound down, and the silence that followed was so complete that Reidar could hear the aeration fans, coasting to a stop, a sound like a long-held breath let go. He stood at the base of the steel in the late light, his hand against the cold wall of bin 1, and he felt the emptiness inside it through the metal, the way you feel the absence of something that was very full. He had never heard a bin this quiet. He had never had a bin worth being this quiet. The wire transfer hit the business account at 417, $1,742,000, minus the final operating costs and storage losses, and what remained after Eldon's 200,000 was more than the farm had held at once in 3 generations of Vangens. He walked into the First National Bank of Tollerud at 4:45, still wearing his harvest dust. He went straight to Eldenbrecht's office and set his phone on the desk with the screen up. Eldon looked at the transfer receipt for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up, and his eyes were bright, in the way a grown man's eyes get bright when the thing he didn't want to do does not have to be done. Eldon's hand found the foreclosure paperwork on the corner of the desk, and he held it a moment, and then he tore it cleanly in half and dropped it in the wastebasket, and the sound it made was the smallest enormous sound Reidar had ever heard. Eldon sat back in his chair. How, Reidar? How did you hold on to all of it? Reidar looked at the empty phone screen on the desk between them. My grandfather told me something a long time ago, he said. When the bin is empty, the buyer makes the rules. He picked up the phone and slipped it into his pocket. I kept mine full long enough to make my own. Drive safe going home, Reidar. He drove home under a sky that had gone clear and hard and starry, the kind of sky that only happens over the Red River Valley in deep winter, when every last bit of moisture has been wrung out of the air and what's left is perfectly transparent, and the stars looked close enough to be miscounted. Solveig was waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee she handed to him without a word. He took it and stood beside her, and they looked out at the 3 empty bins standing in the last of the evening light, silver and enormous and absolutely hollow, catching the afterglow of a sun already gone, and he thought that the strangest thing about them now was how beautiful they were empty. Full they had been a siege. Empty they were proof of something. They stood there until the cold drove them in, and then they sat at the kitchen table, and Reidar called Casper's cell phone and told him the number, and the silence on the other end of the line had a quality he'd never heard from the boy before, and he told him to take a week and come back doubled, because the farm was going to need him in spring and intended to keep him longer than that, if he'd stay. After he hung up, he sat a while longer with the storm glass in his hands. The crystals had settled now, drifting back down toward the bottom in the slow way they always did when the pressure had finally equalized, and the thing the atmosphere had been building toward had built itself out. It would climb again. It always did. The world was not a place that ran out of weather. I thought about Anton Vangen standing in a farm sale line in 1984 with everything he owned in a pile, selling it at a price a frightened man accepts. He thought about the letter folded small in a pine box for 40 years, never sent addressed to a son who was told a better version of the story instead. He thought about what it cost to pass a wound down as a lesson and what it cost to finally say the lesson plain. He set the storm glass on the table and went to the kitchen drawer and took out a sheet of paper. He wrote 1 sentence on it in his own hand, nothing like the old country slant of his grandfather's. He folded it once and set it under the storm glass and left it there for the morning. Spring in the Red River Valley does not arrive the way it does in softer places. It comes up out of the ground before it comes from the sky, a subtle loosening, a change in what the mud sounds like under a boot. The snow goes gray before it goes away, and the fields breathe a cold breath that smells of last year's corn, and the year before that, and every year the land can remember. It was a morning in the first week of May when Casper found the storm glass on the porch rail. I was heading out to run the moisture probe on the seed corn storage, and he almost walked past it, and then he stopped and picked it up, surprised by its weight, the liquid and crystal of it shifting in the glass. He turned it in his hand the way he'd seen Reidar turn it, and he felt the folded paper against his palm, and opened it. He read the single sentence. He read it again. Then he looked up at the 3 empty bins standing in the warm May light, the steel already starting to sweat in the first real heat, throwing back the sun in long dazzling lines across the black yard. And he understood, without anyone explaining it to him, that he was being handed something that wasn't the glass at all, that the glass was just the shape of it, that what was being passed to him was a posture toward the world, a way of standing still while everything around you was moving too fast, and calling it wisdom, and calling it the business, and calling it the only way. Reidar came out of the house with his coffee and found the boy standing there with the glass in his hand and the folded paper, and he said nothing, and Casper said nothing, and the two of them stood on the porch in the first warm morning of the year, while the fields steamed and the beans dried in the light, and the note in Casper's hand said only this: "It never told us the weather. It only asked us to stay awake. The world is full of people who sell in October because they're afraid. It always has been, and it always will be, and the price has always been set by the ones who need it sold before the ones who can afford to wait." Reidar Vangen did not outsmart anyone. He did not get lucky. He paid attention, and he paid it with everything he had: the home quarter, 2 bins of sleep, 1 winter of his marriage, and every comfortable story he'd ever believed about himself. He paid it with the thing his grandfather had tried to pay and run out of at the last moment. He paid it with the willingness to be wrong until he wasn't. If this story found you at the end of a long day, in the quiet, where you keep the things that actually matter to you, what is it that you've been holding that everyone around you has already sold? Leave your answer below. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. We'll keep the lamp on.